Welcome everyone. My name is Philip Murphy. I'm director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. Welcome to the special online seminar on China's global media and the Commonwealth. The usual housekeeping rules. We are recording this session. Please, if you're not speaking, mute your microphones. And if you could use the chat function to ask questions, you can put an electronic hand up in the Q&A session if you want to ask a question in person. But if a thought or question occurs to you while our speakers are presenting, please do just put a question or comment in the chat, and Kieran, who will be helping to chair, will round these questions up at the very end. This seminar is part of a broader project at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, monitoring media freedom in the Commonwealth. This project was launched in 2017. And I think we have an extremely strong cluster of experts, particularly amongst our senior research fellows at the Institute, many of whom have backgrounds in the media and as distinguished commentators on various aspects of contemporary Commonwealth and media affairs. And we launched that project in 2017 with a special conference on the Commonwealth and challenges to media freedom. The Institute has also convened a working group on media and good governance, which brought in a number of Commonwealth partner organisations, including the Commonwealth Journalists Association and the Commonwealth Lawyers Association. And in March 2018, the working group agreed a set of Commonwealth principles on freedom of expression, which we hope will form the basis of concerted action by the Commonwealth. And the specific issue of China has been an ongoing subject of interest to us, and what increasing Chinese influence means for Commonwealth influence and the upholding of Commonwealth values. And we're particularly interested in how that operates around freedom of expression. So I'd like to thank Kieran Hassan and Sue Onslow for putting this program together, and our distinguished speakers for giving up their time today. I'd like to introduce them, beginning with Daya Thuso, who's Professor of International Communication at the School of Communication and Film, Hong Kong Baptist University. He previously served many years as professor at the University of Westminster, where he was founder and co-director of the Indian Media Centre. He's a prolific author of over 20 books, including China's Media Go Global, published in 2018. And his most recent book is BRICS Media, Reshaping the Global Communication Order, published by Routledge this year. We're also delighted to have Stephen Vines, who is a Hong Kong-based author and award-winning journalist. Stephen moved to Hong Kong way back in 1987 as the Southeast Asia correspondent of The Observer. 5 years later, he became The Guardian's Hong Kong correspondent. And he subsequently worked for The Independent and Radio Television Hong Kong, as well as being a regular contributor to the Asian Wall Street Journal, Fortune, and the Daily Telegraph. He's four-time winner of the Amnesty International Human Rights Press Awards, and his books include Hong Kong, China's New Colony, and The Years of Living Dangerously, Asia from Crisis to the New Millennium. And joining them, we're also delighted to have on the panel Sally Ann Wilson, who's CEO of the Public Media Alliance, the largest global association of public broadcasters. She began her career in BBC Radio, and she's produced numerous award-winning documentaries in the UK and the USA. Sally Ann was appointed Secretary General of the Commonwealth Broadcasting Association in 2010, and in 2014 led its transformation into the Public Media Alliance. So we couldn't be more fortunate, I think, in our panelists today. And I'd like, without further ado, to ask Professor Thusu to speak to us.
Thank you, Professor Murphy and Dr. Hassan for inviting me to this event. It's a special honor for me because many years ago in 1988, in fact, I came to the UK on a Commonwealth scholarship, postdoc, from what was then called FCO. So I have a certain association with Commonwealth going all the way back to 1988. So it's incredible pleasure to be speaking to some old friends and some new ones, I hope. The topic that I'm going to be addressing is a huge one because China is everywhere, including in the Commonwealth. So how China is getting into the Commonwealth countries is something I'll be looking at from the media perspective. But before I talk about media specifically, I want to also contextualize with the hard power of China, where the economic expansion of Chinese presence globally. And I have a few slides that I want to share with you so that it is contextualized. Let me try if I can share the screen. Okay, all right. Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Before I start, I also should apologize because I've been in this Zoom version of academic conversation for over a year now, but I cannot cope with the questions that emerge on the screen. So if we'll wait for the discussion after I finish. I don't want to break my chain of thought. And also, my email is there. So those of you who wanted to get back to me on something I say, which is contentious, which I hope some of the ideas might be, you're very welcome to contact me on that email. Now, if you think of China, it's already a risen power. It's not a rising power anymore. And like within the Commonwealth, it's everywhere else. If you think of the Commonwealth for a start, the 4 of the 5 I nations, 5 I's, right, exclude the US, so UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. The white Commonwealth is deeply entangled with China. Then you look at the cluster in South Asia, where again, Chinese presence is very dominant. Even in India, where there are border issues, Chinese investment is pretty strong. And then we look at the Caribbean, which is the other cluster, Chinese presence is growing. And of course, Africa, where it is perhaps most pronounced, especially in the context of media presence. So I will talk about these things, but before I talk about media specifically, I wanted to just share with you the hard power, as it were, of China. As all of us know now, China is already emerging as a serious competitor to the kind of liberal world order that was set up after the Second World War. In terms of hard power, this is the latest information that you see on the screen from Pentagon, which has re-evaluated China's military strength. And it now is claiming that by 2030, China would be sitting on 1,000 stockpiles of nuclear warheads. You also see on the screen Chinese military bases outside China. Djibouti was the first one, but since then they also have one in Tajikistan and also in Myanmar. These are declared ones. But just to put that in context, the United States has 700 declared military bases across the globe. So before we get too excited about China's military power, let's get that into perspective. Similarly, defense budget, China's defense budget is growing very rapidly, but when you compare it with $700 billion annual budget of the United States, it is, nowhere near that mark. So there is a very serious concern about this rise of China, because whether it is the territorial dispute between India and China, which, as you know, last year led to actual border clash in which there were deaths, or South China Sea, which has implications for Commonwealth countries like Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei, or the Djibouti is already there on the screen, the growing presence in African continent. Even more interesting is the economic growth of China. And this is nothing short of phenomenal. You don't have to be an economist to understand the scale of change. A newspaper reader, serious newspaper reader would know. Just look at this. I did some data crunching looking at publicly available information from Fortune 500. Something really significant happened last year, the year of the COVID. That for the first time, there were more Chinese multinational companies in the top 500 than the United States. And as you look at this chart, from 10, just 20 years ago, to 124 last year. That is nothing short of a phenomenal growth. And you see also a corresponding decline in a grouping which always, since its inception in the late 1950s, was a preserve of the United States and some European countries, and later Japan. So Asia was generally out. Now Asia is leading it, China especially. Some of you may have seen the McKinsey's report earlier this week, which says that China is now the richest country in terms of assets. In the last 20 years, from 2000 to 2020, 50% of net global growth has been by one country, by China. In comparison, the US figures are 22%. In GDP purchasing power parity term, China has been, since 2014, already the world's largest economy. It is the world's largest trading nation. It has is the largest trading partner of over 100 countries. Now, these are very basic facts, and they cannot be overlooked in any serious conversation about China's presence globally. And then you have this, the BRI. Again, a very interesting Commonwealth connection, because the flagship program of BRI is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPAC, $60 billion and counting. And of course, it's called all kinds of geopolitical and economic implications. So there's this whole idea of digital maritime road, and and also polar road, which is so for some countries actually, if the Earth gets warmer, is good business because you can reach Europe via the Arctic much quicker than going through the other routes. Chinese foreign exchange reserves before COVID hit us, the world, was $3 trillion. And just by way of comparison, think of the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, and think of what it did in terms of American presence on European continent. Now that multiply that by 20 times, and with a global geographical, because now over 100 countries are involved in BRI, and there are 900 projects for the next 10 years. We're talking something in the range of $1.9 trillion of investment. Of course, there are lots of issues involved with it, bad debt, using this for other political purposes, etc. But it's also interesting that the only major economy in the region, for example, which didn't join BRI was India. So again, there is an interesting point about maybe different systems, but we'll come to that perhaps in the discussion. So to kind of legitimize this extraordinary expansion, which has happened in the last 2 decades, China needs to have its version of events to be told to the world. And it has been very seriously working on this for at least 2 decades, if not longer. One way of describing it was a well-known book with that title, Charm Offensive, which came out a few years ago. Since then, there have been a lot more publications. The latest one from my colleague, Ying Zhu, about it's interesting title, Soft Power with Chinese Characteristics. Now, China is not seen as a soft power. China is seen as a hard power. And it is no coincidence that in 2017, when the National Endowment for Democracy published a report about what it called sharp power, China and Russia were identified as exemplifiers of that new version of soft power. It was defined as a power which pierces, penetrates, or perforates the political and information environments in the targeted countries. As if it's only these 2 countries who are doing this, right? There's a long history of subversion, including media, induced subversion in various parts of the world. So the Chinese project of going out, as it was called in the initial decade, has been a very wide-ranging project. It has various dimensions, including, educational involvement, Confucius institutes, Confucius schools, also, as well as a huge infrastructural investment, especially in communication field. There was a report published by Freedom House, a well-known US-based think tank, which looked at different dimensions of this expansion, whether it is specific training programs for journalists from various, especially developing countries, or it is a transfer of technology which has very clear and not particularly hidden surveillance dimensions. And this is just an overview of various projects that Chinese government has been involved in creating what has been described by some people as Sino-globalization. And this phrase has got a bit of currency, interestingly enough, only recently. And the Chinese also do not use it very often. It's actually outsiders who are studying China, they claim to use it. Now, my involvement with China has been relatively recent. I have to, when I was being introduced as an expert, I've never claimed to be an expert on as complex a place as China, primarily because I don't know the language. So my understanding and culture, although I was very privileged to spend a year in Beijing at Xinhua University, I was a visiting professor there, and that was a very intellectually very interesting experience. Although I have to qualify that by saying I was in an American, very liberal American college within Xinhua University. But my association goes back much longer, because at the University of Westminster, where I taught for many years, we had the China Media Center, which was the first of its kind in Europe. And I had the privilege to be the research advisor to that center. In that capacity, I was able to travel frequently. I've done lectures in various universities in China. And one of the outcome of this association was this book we published in 2018, China's Media Go Global, which with my colleagues, Professor Hugo de Berg, who was the director of the China Media Center, and Professor Shi Bin, who is a leading figure in communication, international communication in China. He's a professor at Tsinghua University. And we'd done a major conference in Xinhua in 2017, and the book came out a year later. So this was one of the first kind of books in English language which looked at various dimensions of China's international media presence. Not just news media, which is what I'm going to be focusing on in today's talk, but also other aspects, diasporic media, for instance, entertainment industry, etc., gaming. So what was then described as central media included Xinhua News Agency, major Chinese presence, and one of the oldest as far as China is concerned in terms of its international presence. China Global Television Network, CGTN, which used to be called CCTV-10, in the English language network, which was started actually way back in 2001. But in recent years, last 3-4 years, I think it was 2017, or, when they renovated, rebranded it as China Global Television Network. I'll speak more about that in a minute. China Radio International, People's Daily, the party's mouthpiece, China Daily, the party's mouthpiece for external audience, and Global Times, a more popular version of Chinese media presence globally. And because it is sometimes a bit more provocative, so it gets more citations than the other more sober or more state-oriented. This is also state, but it takes a little more liberty with what it says about the world. So let me go in some detail about some of these, especially the television network. As you see on this map, it is now one of the most, at least widely available television network. And it, apart from English, it is also available in Russian, Arabic, French, and Spanish, but also has specific, and also German actually, but also it has specific feeds for America. Been in the news recently, CGTN America for non-journalistic reasons, or you might say journalistic reasons, we can discuss that. And of course, Africa, where CGTN has been present. And again, a very interesting Commonwealth connection. The base of CGTN in Africa is in Nairobi, in Kenya. And it is arguably one of the major players in that continent. Also present in other major Commonwealth countries, Nigeria, for instance, as well as in South Africa. And then you have something called Star Times, which is again a Chinese government-owned terrestrial and digital television network, which is specifically focused on sub-Saharan Africa. Now, CGTN also has presence in social media. I was looking at their figures. They claim to have 13.4 million followers on Twitter. And as you know, Twitter is banned in Chinese mainland, but Twitter is used, as is Facebook and YouTube and other Western platforms, to tell the Chinese version of world events to a global audience. So arguably, this is the most important Chinese global voice. And as you see, it's in different languages. And then you have the Chinese International Radio, China Radio International, which has more language services than any other broadcaster in the world. But it also has sort of private or non-governmental radio stations. I called it client stations, and you can see on the map they are focused around certain parts of the world. United States, for example, Canada, Australia, but also in parts of Europe. And then the oldest Chinese global presence is in the news agency Xinhua. And as you see at the bottom of this slide, it is not quite there with the top three, AP, Reuters, or AFP, but it's pretty big, 180 bureaus, according to this figure. It was set up, even before the 1949 revolution, so it has a longer history. And these are not just news organizations. I think that's worth emphasizing. A lot of, for example, Xinhua, if you want to get Xinhua for free, you might also like to, the Chinese will give you broadband access, for instance, or access to satellite at a cheaper rate, or Wi-Fi, facilities. So it's not just news they're interested in promoting, but also a kind of hardware for communication. Once you have the hardware, it's easy to supply software. That seems to be the argument. Then you also have a very localized version of this information supply. And this is a map of the world where you see the number of publications that they have partnership, meaning that the content of Chinese official media is used in these countries, for example, 39 in the United States. Many of these are diasporic publications. As we know, China has the largest diaspora in the world. So the idea is to use that resource to promote the Chinese narrative to a skeptical world. So, as I said, CCTV-10, as it was called, has been in operation for 20 years. And I'm still waiting for them to break an international story, like BBC does on a monthly basis, or CNN does, or even RT, much maligned RT does that frequently. Al Jazeera, of course. So it's a very different kind of journalism. It is state information. Is devoid of any kind of critical engagement. Forget about the domestic issues, but even international issues are rather presented in a very bland and I would say limited manner. But yet, there is an interesting approach that they are taking, which is that was sometimes described as constructive journalism. The phrase is borrowed from some work done in Denmark, that we are not doing critical journalism, we are doing constructive journalism. We want to emphasize the positive things that are happening in the world, especially in the developing world. So I think it's also interesting that, you know, sitting in London or New York, you may not think this as a major player, but if you're in Addis Ababa or in Sri Lanka or in Lahore, where Professor Hassan, Dr. Hassan is, I think, at the moment, it's a different story. But even more interesting than this is now what is happening to the digital space, because everything in any case is moving into that space. And there China has done something remarkably interesting. From a perspective of freedom or human rights or liberalism, is deeply problematic, because even the media that I've discussed so far are little more than the mouthpieces of the state, which is a synonym for the party. So that's a given. I don't think that requires a lot of discussion, especially in this kind of an audience. But what is often not discussed, for example, about the Chinese internet. So the debate is about, oh, it is the Great Wall of China, it is the censorship regime, it is the control of thought and ideas, and which is all true. But some people have argued, yours faithfully included, that precisely because it was a controlled system, they were able to develop their own internet. Everybody else, with possible exception of Russians in certain platforms, are very happy to use internet infrastructure, which is not theirs. And I'm talking about serious countries. I'm talking about Germany, Britain, France. India has the second largest internet in the world today. Platforms are all foreign. Not just foreign, they're from one particular part of the United States. So in that book I mentioned, I use this phrase cyber, in a chapter that I wrote, I use this phrase cyber capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And I argued that in this very Western view of democracy, freedom, liberalism, etc., we've forgotten that there is also an, internet economy. And the Chinese have done extremely well. Every platform that you and I use has a Chinese equivalent today. And these are not just confined to the territorial space of the People's Republic of China. They're increasingly globalizing. Take, for example, TikTok. TikTok now has 1 billion downloads. It is one of the most widely used short video platforms in the world. A lot of kids are using it around the world who don't know that this is actually a Chinese company and the data might be going to questionable places. So, as I mentioned earlier, in the context of CGTN having a Twitter presence, most Chinese media organizations today, the state-affiliated media organizations, as they are now clearly marked by Western and basic American platforms, they are using those platforms to talk back, the so-called Wolf 2 diplomacy. So the official spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry would be using Twitter to say kind of things that they would not say on CGTN or on the pages of China Daily. It's quite an interesting shift. Related to that is also what's happening to the 5G technology, the mobile communication world, because China is already speaking about the industrial internet. In fact, this week there was a report in one of the Chinese official media that they want to bring 5G to every village in the country. Just think of the scale, 1.4 billion people. I have family in London, and when I'm doing Zoom with them, more often than not, the system doesn't work. So I say, well, you guys are in London, it should work. So, no, it doesn't work. So I go to a different room to talk to you, right? So, and where I'm now in Hong Kong is quite interesting, because there's this whole idea of the Greater Bay Area, which might emerge, that's the plan, as an alternative Silicon Valley. Already China has launched 6G satellites. We are still, much of the world is 3G, 4G. And so if you look at this chart in terms of patents, AI and other, this latest technology, China is ahead of everybody else. Now, this was going very smoothly, all this process for the last 20 years, and then COVID hit us. And suddenly, BRI, question marks, Chinese telephone, mobile companies, question marks, etc. And border disease. It's very interesting. All this thing has really heated up in the last year or so. And China also had to sort of tell its story to counter the negative coverage it was getting in mainstream media, for instance, about COVID-19, and that has not been resolved now, as we know, including the origins of this most serious pandemic to hit the world. So it wasn't unusual at the beginning of last year when this all started to identify the virus with China. And I'm not talking about somebody's blog or some tabloidy publication. I'm talking here of one of the most serious news magazines in the world, namely Spiegel. That's their cover. And then you had this, which is from a retweet from India, retweeted by the most famous Bollywood star. His name is Amitabh Bachchan. Some of those who know South Asian cinema would know. And aspersions were raised on a particular individual who is still head of WHO. Suggestions were made that WHO is funded by China. Or I mean, it is funded by China too, as many other countries funded. But you go to their website and you see that one Mr. Gates is paying a lot more than Chinese government. And then the United States and other European countries are the main, contributors. This is public knowledge. And then you had this special report on CNN. And these are just selections from 3 different parts of the world. And this is part of a bigger problem, not just confined to China. China is obviously a much greater challenge than any other country to the standard Western order, or Western shaped order, if you like. But it is dealing with a media system, a global media system, which remains very clearly dominated by a few countries. And that reflects in the way, for instance, the whole pandemic coverage has taken shape. It might just be worth reminding our audience here that the first country to develop the vaccine was Russia. It was Sputnik. And I'm not sure many people know that, they were doing it months before anything happened in Oxford or in the United States. So let me just then end with some reflections, so we have more time for discussion, and I'm also waiting to hear from my 2 co-panelists. China in a Chinese media in a post-COVID world. Now, I admit that it is a bit premature to speak of a post-COVID world when, especially addressing people in London where the cases are rising across Europe. Europe is now the epicenter of the epidemic. But there are also suggestions that maybe the worst is over, and it's like there are moments in history. I studied history in university before I started teaching communication. There are like 91, Soviet Union gone, Cold War over. 2007-8, the first serious crisis of Anglo-globalization, if you like. And now COVID. It wasn't unusual to see this discussion getting into mainstream media. This was a cover story in The Economist last year, which asked a very pertinent question: is China winning? The geopolitical consequences of COVID-19. And if you just look at the figures, they speak for themselves. The number of deaths, hospitalization, etc., is remarkably lower than any other comparable country in the world. So, and they're touting it as a reflection of their political system or their social arrangements and their efficiency and their organization, etc., etc. That's an interesting area to think about because out of the 54 Commonwealth countries, majority of countries are actually developing countries, and many of them are very small countries. So Chinese vaccines, Chinese masks, Chinese mass diplomacy might have some impact there. But there are also very obvious and very severe limitations of this kind of narrative being taken seriously around the world. Of course, in the Western world, there is a very understandable skepticism. But also in other parts of the world, there are studies, for example, in South Africa, which show that there is deep suspicion bordering on hostility about the Chinese presence in that country. Similarly, in fact, one of our students has just submitted a PhD on, her study was on Nigeria. And again, that skepticism emerges in countries which are used to a different kind of media system, a media system where debate and discussion are part of the discourse. And the Chinese media has yet to understand that you cannot just put the official version of events and assume that people will engage with that. It might also be the reason might be deeper. The reason might be a kind of limitation with storytelling skills, because after all, we're talking about mass audience. We're not talking about specialists on China or geopolitical experts or business experts. We're talking about average viewer or average consumer of international media. So the storytelling skills are very important, and I think they are strikingly missing in these official narratives. By way of example, comparison, just imagine for a moment that American global media presence was through Voice of America. There was no New York Times, there was no Atlantic, there was no New Yorker. Just imagine how boring that would be. Why would anybody listen to Voice of America? It might be far more professionally produced than a party organ, but it will be considered as the mouthpiece of a government. Now, if you look at the Chinese situation, everything is coming from the state system. And that state system is rooted in a particular political ideology, political system, right? but there's very limited debate and discussion. So the capacity to go into more detail, more, you know, I read the China Daily every day. Is available for free in my office, in my school building, and I'm desperate to find something which is trying to provide. I read it to find out details of what's happening. I study these things, but the analysis is missing, and that's a tragedy. So it's not just that they're incapable of doing that, but it's just that there are certain norms and structures within which they work as journalists, and they're, like, more often than not, working in a very bureaucratic, very restricted system. So that limits the Chinese presence in, and I think with Commonwealth countries, certainly many of the big ones, there's also a tradition of democratic political systems, a more plural debate and discussion, although that's being restricted in many places, as we know. But there is they're not one-party states. So there is a genuine and very basic skepticism. They're very happy with the money that is coming with it, the technology which is coming with it, but narratives, I think there is a problem. One big debate, which is already underway for the last 5, 6, maybe 10 years now, is going to be about the so-called democratic versus authoritarian internet. Because as I indicated earlier, China has the largest internet in the world, and it is not just now confined to the territorial area of China. For example, in cloud computing, etc., huge investment. So that debate is going to be very interesting to watch in terms of, is it like kind of standard binary? There are other models. Russian internet is quite an interesting case in point. What's happening in India is also very, very interesting, because there are a lot of people in India who are saying, why should we give our data to Facebook? Mr. Ambani very clearly said in a public meeting that this is data colonialism, and this is the second war of independence we have to fight to retain data. So, and remember, that's again, we're talking about 1.4 billion people already, nearly 800 million are connected. So that debate is going to be more interesting than just this binary. Perhaps most importantly for me, in terms of China's globalization, is how China has dealt with, which I think is the most remarkable achievement, which is to, if not eliminate, but basically deal with the problem of poverty, extreme poverty we're talking about here. Last year, in fact, China officially announced that it has banished extreme poverty. Now, this has been done in last 20, 30 years at the most. From 700 million people who were living in below the poverty line, which is like $100, which is appallingly low, to having zero extreme poverty. Now, if you're telling that to somebody in Addis Ababa, or in Thailand, or in Bangladesh, they're going to look at it perhaps more seriously than somebody in Brussels or London or New York. And I think that's where China's global presence is making a tangible difference. And that's why when BRI is there, or several other, there are also many other regional, cooperative programs, etc., and bilateral ones, that it creates some interesting discussion. So, and that has implications, remember, to the what I described sometimes as a majority world. That's where the 90% of the world lives. And I think the West has been trying to remove poverty through, and remember, this is not being done by Save the Children or Oxfam. It's done by the state. So I think that's also raising some interesting questions in many quarters about state-led capitalism. This is a very capitalist country, but has a very different model. So people are already talking about a different model. And that raises very basic questions about what then happens to freedom of expression, what happens to plurality of opinion, what happens to human rights. As we speak, a very famous tennis star, Chinese tennis star, is missing, right? And the response that the Chinese official media put out was so clumsy that there were stories about that response. And we all know about Mr. Jack Ma's problems with the bosses in Beijing. So it's a very complicated story, but I do think that the last point about being able to provide a different discourse about development is, in my view, perhaps the most important Chinese trump card, as it were, when it comes to the majority world. The problem is that China is almost obsessive about United States. As I said, I spent a year in a top university in China, and I found that really their interest in other parts of the world was very limited. So although they are there, the presence is growing, as I indicated in my talk, but the understanding is very superficial. It's very business-like. And therefore, although they're trying this to, but when it comes to basic, basic facilities, basic, you might even say basic human rights, then perhaps China has something to offer. And that creates lots of issues for the rest of us. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening. Very happy for questions and taking questions and comments. Thank you.
Professor Thusu, thank you very much indeed for those very insightful remarks. We're enormously grateful. Please let us move directly then to Stephen Vines to make his reflections from his perspective in Hong Kong and as an extremely experienced journalist. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Well, thank you very much, Sue. And thank you to the Institute for inviting me. I do appreciate that. Of course, the thing about Hong Kong is it was the only part of China that ever had a history of free media. The thing about Hong Kong after the handover of power in 1997 was that, among many other things, it was promised freedom of expression and liberties that were supposed to create the one country, two systems situation in Hong Kong, where China would operate its system, Hong Kong would operate a very different system. And it was supposed to prove that China, the great China, 1.4 billion people, could live with the rest of the world in a way where it honored agreements that it had made, and that it would tolerate freedom in one part of China according to an international treaty. And as a spoiler alert, let me tell you, all of that has not happened, just has not happened. But let me put this in some kind of context, because it's not as though Hong Kong has always had free media. On the contrary, Hong Kong's media history is very interesting. Immediately, not immediately, but shortly after the colony was formed in 1841, you started to see the emergence of newspapers. The newspapers were largely, if not entirely, controlled by commercial interests wishing to further their own interests. That was followed much later by the development of newspapers under political party control, by which I mean the Communist Party and the Kuomintang, who were vying for the hearts and minds of Hong Kong people and produced some of the dullest newspapers in the world. In 1928, the government itself decided to get involved in the media game by launching the public broadcaster, then known as Radio Hong Kong. And frankly, it was little more than a propaganda outfit. And it remained so, remarkably, until well into the 1970s. It was not a public broadcaster in the sense that people who are listening to this would understand that term. But although the media scene was fairly dire in Hong Kong, during the bulk of the colonial period, what you did have was media regulated by rule of law. What you did have was a toleration of dissent. And remember, that extended even to the 1960s, when the Cultural Revolution madness across the border extended to Hong Kong, and there was an uprising by party-inspired people causing deaths on the streets. So even in the darkest days, you still had a toleration of media, even a toleration of media which was advocating what was effectively the physical destruction of the colony. The big change, and it's remarkable when you think about it, it was so recent, the big change came in the 1980s. Radio Television Hong Kong became Radio Television Hong Kong, no longer Radio Hong Kong, became a genuine public broadcaster. It was no longer a government mouthpiece, and it very often clashed with the government. You had in the written media, in the printed media, a variety of voices, very influential. For example, the Chinese language newspaper Mingbao, launched by the famous writer Louis Cha, was a champion of independent media. And you even had in the English language media, controlled, ironically, by Rupert Murdoch at the time, the South China Morning Post, pursuing, I would say, quite an independent path in the media world. By the 1990s, the media scene was transformed. There was immense competition. Newspapers were profitable. Incidentally, the South China Morning Post was supposed to be the most profitable newspaper in the world at the time. And you had a transformation, not only of newspapers, but also of broadcasting. And you had the launch, and this was a very significant thing, of the Next Media Group producing Next Magazine and Apple Daily, both of which were founded by Jimmy Lai, now in jail. What these two publications did was transform the look of journalism. I mean, it's hard to describe how different they looked from what had existed before, but they did. But the other remarkable thing they did, and I speak as someone who's been a journalist all my life, and I haven't seen this anywhere else in the world, was they combined extremely racy journalism, and I mean racy journalism, with serious comment, with real reporting of events, and incidentally, extensive reporting of world affairs. Can you imagine, to be parochial for a moment, a British red-top newspaper devoting pages and pages to what's going on in the rest of the world? It simply does not happen. It did happen with the launch, particularly of Apple Daily. Now, in 1994, I was actually part of this so-called media revolution, becoming the founding editor of Eastern Express, which became Hong Kong's third English language newspaper. Now, I just mention this to say, because I'm in a position to say it without qualification, launching a newspaper, as we did in the record period of just 4 months, was an enormously difficult thing to do. But the one thing that we never had to do was look over our shoulders and have a worry about what the authorities were going to do and how they might or might not censor our output. We certainly had a lot of, I could say, vigorous discussion with people in authority, but that's the media all over the world. There's nothing special about that, and I don't complain about it. It was truly a halcyon age. The shock of the Tiananmen massacre of democracy protesters in 1989 had receded into memory. The optimism of what would happen after 1997, when China was promising one country, two systems, China was promising a high degree of autonomy for Hong Kong, China was promising Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong, led many people to say, you know what, we perhaps are a bit fearful of the change of sovereignty in 1997, but you know, it's going to be okay. Things will be okay. And of course, for the purposes of this discussion, freedom of expression was guaranteed. It's also incidentally guaranteed in the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, a document much changed and barely worth the paper it's printed on. So you have this situation of vibrant media, quite high levels of optimism, and rarely in history can you pinpoint the moment when things changed quite as radically as they did. And that moment can be pinpointed to Xi Jinping's ascension to power in 2012. This was immediately followed by an enormous crackdown of dissent on the Chinese mainland itself. But you know, even then, in Hong Kong, people said, well, that's what's going on in the mainland. There's nothing for us to worry about here. Or if there is something for us to worry about, it certainly won't be the sort of thing that's happening across the border. Then you had in 2014 these enormous protests, which became known as the Umbrella Movement. And that really focused Beijing's attention on needing to bring Hong Kong under control. And we now know, we didn't know at the time, but we now know that it was during this period that China drew up plans essentially to eradicate civil society as it was known, to impose far greater direct control from Beijing. No longer was Beijing going to rely on its various ciphers in Hong Kong to do the work. There was an immense focus on the education system because it was believed, and all dictatorships believe this, that if young people oppose the dictatorship, they do so because they've been misled in schools. And of course, there was the bringing under control of the political system. And of course, there were very intensive attempts to bring this free and rather riotous media under control. Fast forward to 5 years later, 2019, when we had the largest protest movement ever seen in Hong Kong, incidentally, one of the largest protests seen anywhere in the world. And if doubt had ever existed in Beijing that Hong Kong was out of control, that ended. You could say that the protests themselves were a bit of a wake-up shock to the Communist Party's leadership. But incidentally, I think a bigger shock were the local elections in 2019, electing district councillors. These are not people with great power. But what was significant about these elections, peaceful as all Hong Kong elections have always been, orderly and democratic up to a point, was that in every single constituency where a contest was allowed, the Democrats swept the board. This was a situation which Beijing could not tolerate, would not tolerate, and as we have seen, has not tolerated. This was the moment when the one country, two systems principle, if you like, was effectively declared dead by the leadership in Beijing. But of course, in the great Orwellian tradition of these things, they always say, when wishing to assert the one country element of one country, two systems, we are preserving one country, two systems. At this point, the legislature was purged of opposition members. Over 10,500 people were arrested for politically related offences. Let me put that in some context. Hong Kong has a population of 7.4 million people. To arrest that number of people is staggering by any measure, but in such a small population, it's even more staggering. And in the context of China as a whole, there were more people arrested in 2019 and 2020 for politically related offensive than in the Chinese mainland. Not often can you say that about the situation in China. And then, like a stack of cards, you had the collapse of civil society. Civil society organizations closing, trade unions closing, community associations closing, student unions either being forced to close or voluntarily closing. And then, of course, because this is what authoritarian regimes do, they targeted the media. And the bit of the media that the people in Beijing were most obsessed by, and their ciphers in Hong Kong obviously reflected that concern, was the enormously popular Apple Daily newspaper. And Apple Daily now no longer exists. Its senior executives are in jail without trial, incidentally, so far. There was literally police tramping through the premises of the newspaper, seizing materials, seizing computers, etc., to visibly demonstrate that the end of the newspaper was to hand, and very shortly after it did indeed stop publication. What happened to the other media organizations? Still there, obviously. What happened to them was that none of them by now, and we're talking about 2019, were supporting the democracy movement. At most, they were anodyinely neutral, but more likely and more often, papers that had been known to be vaguely government supporting became even more avid than some of the official Communist Party organizations in propagating the party line, because of course they felt that unless they were actively demonstrating their adherence to the new order, their fate would be in question. We then come to the situation, which I happen to know intimately, of Radio Television Hong Kong, the public broadcaster at that time. I was the host of the only English language current affairs program, now shut down, and I was a co-host on a weekly basis of another radio program, now also effectively shut down. And what was so depressing about this, and I have to say I wasn't a member of staff there, I was just a contributor. I came in twice a week to do these programs, but what was most absolutely depressing about this was every time I came into the office, there was a new empty desk on the editorial floor. A new person had disappeared. A new person was put under investigation. A new team was brought in to run the station, composed of people who knew absolutely nothing about broadcasting whatsoever, but knew a great deal about control, and they exercised it with alacrity. Apparently, RTHK, Radio Television Hong Kong, has now been perfected. What does that mean? It means the same thing as the perfection of the political system means, which is that when they have elections for the Legislative Council next month, as they will, much delayed incidentally, they will have no opposition candidates whatsoever. People will be offered a choice of red, deep red, or sort of pinkish red, if that's what you prefer. We're in a situation which is obviously dire. I don't think this can be seriously denied, but there is something remarkable. It's not complete. The situation in Hong Kong is still different from that which prevails on the mainland. You still do have independent media. It's all online. It has enormous reach among the Hong Kong population. Most of it is in Chinese, so it's confined to the Hong Kong population and overseas Chinese who can read Chinese characters. How it manages to survive is, in some ways, quite remarkable, but its future, I have to say, is very much in question. More typical than avid, active adherence to the regime is enormous levels of self-censorship. Carrie Lam, Hong Kong's chief executive, told reporters in a marvelous, no, it's not marvelously, in an awful moment, when asked about what were the red lines the media should not cross. She said, and anyone who's read George Orwell will recognize these remarks. I don't think she's read a book, so maybe that's unfair. Obviously she has read books, but I doubt she's read George Orwell. Said, you know where the red lines are. You mustn't cross them. I don't need to spell it out. In other words, what she was saying was that there should be constant and vigorous self-censorship, and that's what you've got. Again, I'm sorry to personalize things, but I talk about what I know. I recently wrote a book, there's a self-promotion alert here, called Defying the Dragon, which is about the protests in Hong Kong. That's not been banned in Hong Kong, but no bookshop will carry it. No mainstream bookshop will carry it. The one bookshop that did carry it has been closed down. It's not that anybody's told these bookshops that the book is a banned book. They've just decided, you know what, much safer not to carry a book like that and remain in business. I don't blame them. They're in a terribly difficult situation. Then you have another aspect of this, which is part of the Hong Kong media story, and in fact is a very big part of the Hong Kong media story, which is the fact that Hong Kong has traditionally been, by which I mean for at least 4 decades, a major international press center. Most of the major international media organizations had either a small or a large presence here. They would certainly have 1 reporter or 2 on the premises. That has dwindled considerably. Incidentally, the government claims that the number of overseas correspondents based in Hong Kong has increased. It's information they have entirely to themselves. I don't know who these people are, but I've never met them. Anyway, the role of Hong Kong as an international media center has not quite been brought to an end, but it's heading in that way. We already saw just last week, one publication, The Economist, one of its reporters, had her application for visa renewal denied. This is not an isolated case. Other reporters have been banned from entry. And every single media organization that has a presence, by which I mean press agencies, television stations, a presence beyond just 1 person, I know for a fact, because I've spoken to them, have contingency plans for moving elsewhere. The situation is so remarkable that one of the online media organizations, this is a Chinese language one, moved to Singapore. Singapore, for Christ's sake. You know, I remember when I was working for The Observer, writing stories about media censorship in Singapore as an example of how effective that could be. But to that particular organization, it seemed like a safer option than remaining in Hong Kong. The point is, if you want to destroy things, it's very easy. You just destroy them. You arrest people. You close things down. This is not difficult. China is an immensely powerful nation. It doesn't have any constraints on its power internally, or at least it doesn't appear to have, but it does pose a question. You can destroy, destroy, and destroy, but what is to replace it? And that's a question that hasn't really been asked. I mean, is Hong Kong just to become another Chinese city, not part of a 1 country, 2 systems principle? Is it going to be a city under dictatorship in the way that the rest of China is? Could China have used the unique opportunity it had, and I don't misuse the word unique, the unique opportunity it had in 1984 when the negotiations for the transfer of power were underway, to demonstrate to the rest of the world that without threatening, without coercion, and without economic bribery, it could be part of the international community in a way that would enhance its prestige and popularity, or it could behave as it does more generally. That opportunity has been entirely squandered. It was offered during the transition of power in Hong Kong. In this mix of threats to Hong Kong as an international center, as a place where rule of law survives, as a place where no one needs to fear the knock on the door in the early hours of the morning by the police force, the fate of the media may seem not to be very significant, but of course, the media is always the canary in the cage, and the canary is very, very sick. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for those chilling remarks about the progressive erosion of media freedom and the institution of authoritarianism, and for emphasizing the importance of self-censorship. As you really underline, progress towards media freedom, freedom of expression is not linear and it is not irreversible. And Hong Kong offers an object lesson in that, which I believe other developing countries across the Commonwealth would do well to attend to, because there is no ineluctable and inevitable movement towards greater liberalism and respect for freedom of expression as a fundamental human right. If we could now move, please, to Sally Ann Wilson. Sally, I'm very aware that this is an issue which has increasingly concerned you, and we're looking forward to your remarks and observations on China's growing presence in media freedom and media landscapes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel today. I come with really a couple of perspectives. Since 2001, I've been watching the growth of China in the global media space very closely. Because in 2001, I joined what was then the Commonwealth Broadcasting Association to run a major project, and then became Deputy Secretary General, and then took over the organisation in 2010. We are now, as Public Media Alliance, PMA, the largest global association of public media organisations worldwide. That involves a lot of travel, a lot of being on the ground, witnessing what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa, China, the Pacific, the Caribbean, etc. But also as a media academic, where back, I think about 15 years ago now, I founded the master's programme in Media and International Development at the University of East Anglia. And my special area is China in the global media space, where I've continued to lecture. It's a subject that I am passionate about, and for so many years it has gone unremarked and unspoken. And thank you to the previous two speakers who have spoken out. My input today is, I think I'll try and make it not too academic, but more experiential. What I've seen and what I've experienced, and just contextualizing that sometimes with more academic thoughts. The growth since 2001 of China in the global media space, and that's the Commonwealth and beyond, has been rapid and substantial. But it's also significant in terms of shaping international narratives. China's international media expansion is historically rooted in its support for liberation movements throughout the Commonwealth and beyond, but particularly within the Commonwealth, as nations in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia and the Pacific and the Caribbean sought their independence. China was there to support them, and that was very real and practical assistance that is still remembered, and remembered quite fondly. Understandably so. The theme of that collaboration was South-South cooperation, and that's a narrative that China has continued to build on. It's an appealing motive. But I would refute that this is a genuine motive. Genuine South-South cooperation and collaboration would involve reciprocity of media coverage. I'll return to that later. There are undoubtedly issues regarding Western media coverage of non-G20 nations. The framing, the type of coverage, we've heard about poverty porn. There's been quite justifiable criticism of the way in which the world has been covered by the big Western media institutions. But there is actually very little coverage at all of African issues in China. China has emphasized that this South-South cooperation is without conditionality. That can be appealing in terms of a development framework, but it raises serious concerns. By 2000, it was evident that China's global image didn't match its growing economic power worldwide, as Professor Thu Su has outlined. China was beginning to re-engage with the world when in 1989, there was a massacre in Tiananmen Square. This really damaged China's global image. Through the early 2000s and then on to towards the Beijing Olympics in 2008, there was increasing concern about China's human rights records, with protests building up to the Beijing Olympics and concerns about Tibet and other human rights issues within China. In 2000, China really made one big step to start addressing these issues with the FOCAC in terms of the Commonwealth. I think this is critical. The Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, set up for the 9th to the 11th of October 2000, which covers, of course, Taiwan's National Day on the 10th of October. But the most significant FOCAC summit, Remedia Cooperation, took place in Beijing in 2006. It's known as the Beijing Action Plan. And it was drawn up under FOCAC between China and 48 African countries. It was a clear turning point for a new, concerted and calculated phase of interventions from China in terms of its attempts to influence the global media space. A key aspect of this was the change to China's going abroad policy, which was formerly limited to trade and business, but now there was big investment from China to include media. And this included an increase in media students attending courses in the West. But it also included a number of other aspects. It was about building bilateral ties and defining common goals in using the media. For example, in facilitating greater knowledge of respective cultures and countering the Western bias, quite justifiable, in the news coverage of China and Africa, as well as reinforcing Sino-African relationships. The 5 points of the Beijing Action Plan listed: increase contact between news media to contribute to comprehensive and objective news coverage of each other, to encourage respective news media to play a positive role in enhancing mutual understanding, multi-level exchanges and cooperation, support and encouragement of more news reporting by news media, mutual facilitation and assistance between news agencies, primarily Xinhua and others across the African continent. The Chinese would continue to host more workshops for African correspondents and heads of media group and press authorities to China, and to expand cooperation in radio and TV broadcasting, help for training for African radio and TV staff. Now, I witnessed this because it was a time where I was visiting African countries in particular on a daily basis, as a weekly basis, as part of my role within the Commonwealth Broadcasting Association. I was seeing that money spent on the ground in terms of infrastructure, training. If we trained somebody, we would go on, and a lot of money was spent, and some of that came from the Commonwealth Media Development Fund. We would be training individuals in Western standards of journalism, where independence is critical. I would go online the following week, and I would see those same journalists in Beijing being trained in China, and that was being reported online and covered online. I witnessed it with my own eyes. Throughout the Commonwealth, I would be walking into, when I joined in 2001, I would be walking into radio stations that were basic, very often in a poor state of repair. TV stations the same, they were underfunded, the training was inadequate. But very quickly, I was walking into the most glamorous, the most expensive media stations around the world. And I could list these throughout Africa, in the Pacific, and more recently in the Caribbean. These new media buildings were being built in exchange for not finance, but actually often for access to fishing rights or mineral rights. I'm giving this really as a very quick presentation because I'm aware of time, but these things can be verified. So we're seeing this huge investment, and we know that there is an investment of $6.6 billion US since 2009 has been spent in shaping international media narratives. Huge investment in media technologies and infrastructure, whether that's in terms of satellites in the global south or better equipment. And it was very responsive. when we saw in broadcasting the change to digitalization, we had massive investments in countries like Tanzania to ensure it was the first to go digital. But look at the financial basis on which that transition occurred. Look at the soft loans. Look at who has the right to turn off a population such as Tanzania of 45 million people. If we look at things like the digital broadcasting standards, there are only a few digital broadcasting standards, as we call them, technologies in the world, DVB being the European one, ATSC in the Americas, and then the Japan one, IDSBN, which is also Japan and Brazil, and now increasingly a few Caribbean countries. Because of the economic crash in the West, this all coincided with less and less investment from the West, less and less development funding, less funding from the Commonwealth, less funding from other aid partners, and just practically less investment. So when DVB was rolled out as a digital standard for broadcasters around the world, there was very little support to that. It was, you can buy the kit, here it is. If you want that standard, go with it. We even saw in many parts of Africa, the Chinese very quickly learning, as Chinese engineers learned how to use the digital broadcasting and DVB standard, and actually going in and maintaining and training in DVB. I mean, that was a critical misstep by those who were exporting this new digital media equipment to bridge the digital divide, as we were told. Even today, in the recent weeks, one of our members, because we are still extensively a membership of Commonwealth countries, but have expanded into the wider world, one of my senior media leaders in Africa has come to me, who has a new digital broadcast center. And he has explained that although he wants a Western system of news flow and news monitoring and the whole news system in that new building, he has to accept the Chinese system with all that that might imply in terms of media freedom. Initially, this support was largely to state-controlled media throughout the Commonwealth and beyond. It often involved content. That content from the early 2000s to 2010, the production values increased and increased, and so it's very high quality content. I was spending time in hotels in African capitals where by watching the television, I was learning more about China than I was learning about Lesotho, Namibia, and Malawi, Mozambique. The content was free, but it wasn't original local content, which is what we would promote as being necessary for citizens to become informed. Although more recently this has also expanded, and I know Professor Thusu spoke about Star Times, the Chinese state-owned company. It's based in Kenya, now has 25 million subscribers in more than 30 countries in Africa. China regularly conducts exchange programs for its foreign reporters from several countries. In 2008, Reporters Without Borders ran a report with the headline, "China Toxic for Africa Freedom." It detailed what this lack of conditionality as part of China's media aid meant, how it had fueled corruption amongst elites and undermined the attempts for many to promote democratic values across China and across much of the global south. This is no longer a story we're hearing just about, and I'll return to Asia in a moment, about the non-G20 countries. Since the Belt and Road Initiative was launched in 2013, similar strategies have been employed by China to engage with European media. Increasingly links with countries such as Italy, where Xinhua partners with ANSA, the Italian state-run news agency. ANSA runs 50 Xinhua stories a day on its news wires, and it works with the Xinhua editorial values. RAI, Italy's public broadcaster, a member of the European Broadcasting Union, has also reached several agreements with China Media Group. The all-encompassing state organization under which China National Television and China Radio function. The latest agreement signed in 2019 with RAI stressed both organizations would collaborate in important projects and initiatives, given the significant role public broadcasters play in the promotion of both countries and their relevant contributions to the development of creative communications and innovative industries. This is worrying as it creeps across Central and Eastern Europe, or Eastern Europe and Central Europe, into countries such as Italy, because it is not about the free, independent media that engages citizens with critical thinking and debate. It is not public broadcasting. This is state media. These attempts go simply beyond telling China's story. Their sharper edge, as Sarah Cook, the research director for China, Hong Kong and Taiwan at Freedom House has said, their sharper edge undermines the democratic norms, erodes national sovereignty and weakens the financial stability of independent media and violates local laws. In Asia, and I recently wrote a chapter for a production on News in Asia, a publication on News in Asia for the Judith Neilson Institute in Australia, which enabled me to work with contributors from across Asia and to review what is happening to news there. It's been subtler in Asia than it was in sub-Saharan Africa. It's the normalization of a new media in the service of the public, an acceptance that national broadcasters provide some public good, especially around information during times of natural disasters or in terms of promoting culture. But what has been removed and obliterated from understanding is the need for editorial independence. This has been legitimized by China. It's also been reinforced by China's funding for the major unions and media groups such as the ABU, the Asian Broadcast Union, across China. That this is a new way of thinking. It's the Eastern way of thinking about media. It is not the democratic way of thinking about media. I've witnessed the same processes in the Pacific and in the Caribbean with my own eyes. So what does this increased global influence of China in the media space mean? Democracy is underpinned by a free media which accepts and acknowledges that it is the role of journalists to question, to hold power to account, to investigate, to be independent. Worldwide, we're seeing the erosion of the profession of journalism and the undermining of editorial independence. We talk very widely about how this is due to the growth of populism and social media. Those are areas of real concern, but we can't ignore China's part in this. What has taken hold with China's increased influence on the global media is an undermining of the independent principles of a free media. Don't take my word for it. The International Federation of Journalists recently conducted an international survey with journalists around the world about China's media influence. One of the comments in the pull together of this research was, the most successful propaganda is the one that doesn't pose as such. Beijing's tactics are incremental but steady, with journalists in each country believing their media systems are strong enough to withstand such developments. But this global survey and examples I've experienced also suggest the Chinese regime is managing to reshape narratives and media landscapes worldwide. It brings us all to where we are today. I have a very small team of journalists who work with us at PMA, and we monitor what's going on globally in terms of public media, which is quite a good weather vane for editorial independent media around the world. We produce something called PSM Weekly, which goes out every Tuesday. You're all welcome to subscribe. In the last 5 years, it has become a very depressing place to be. We always say we sort of sit in a global eyrie where we just monitor. We have support from BBC Monitoring as well, but we have reports from around the world and watching what is changing. Obviously, Stephen himself has experienced what's happened since June 2020 and the new national security laws in Hong Kong. Now, employees there, apart from all the things Stephen talked about, have to take mandatory oaths of allegiance to the Chinese regime. Nobody has yet mentioned Taiwan. In my organization, we've worked with those in Taiwan for many years, and I think what they're seeing in Hong Kong obviously makes them very concerned. We're seeing increasingly sophisticated attacks on foreign media reports from China, whether it's just the BBC or many others, expelling foreign journalists, as Stephen mentioned, and I won't go into details on that. China will quite rightly refer to the impact of Western media imperialism and its long history. It claims its actions are merely an attempt to counter Western dominance of the media and Western media imperience. There are valuable similarities between Chinese and other cultures that we would all do well to embrace, a shared conception of communitarianism, the importance of community in relation to the individual. But there is fundamentally a human desire to debate. we enjoy analysis. And it was interesting after the years, for me, something I'd not thought about until I heard Stephen just now, after all those years of repression in Hong Kong, how when there is a glimmer of democratic debate and a free media, very quickly people want to pay money. You know, suddenly that became one of the most valuable and profitable newspapers in the world, because that is human nature. The influence is really, really strong. I mean, it was only a couple of years ago, before lockdown, that I stood at the annual All-Party Parliamentary Media Group event in the House of Commons and realized that for the first time it was being sponsored by TikTok. I talked to those media leaders and parliamentarians who were beside me in that room, and none of them knew that TikTok was actually Chinese. I've witnessed this and been really upset about it for far too long. But for me, we must return to the notion of reciprocity. I don't want to be unfair. I don't want to be myself, just shaped by Western media imperialism and Western views. I'll use a quote from Gandhi in 1995, which he used in UNESCO. I do not want my house to be walled in on all sides and my windows to be stuffed. I want the culture of all lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible, but I refuse to be blown off my feet by any. Across the Commonwealth, we talk openly about our concerns regarding the influence of social media and, again, the growing threats from populism. But what's happening with China's influence in the media sphere is critical for all of our features. It's critical for the understanding of who influences the global media state, and our democracy depends on it. Thank you, and thank you to the two previous speakers. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much indeed, Sally-Ann, for those very cogent remarks and, as you say, alerting people to how you've tracked it through Public Media Alliance. It's an invaluable website, I have to say, having used it myself. So thank you very much. Well, the seminar will now turn to Dr. Kieran Hassan, who's going to lead the Q&A before I make some final thanks. But Kieran, this section is now under your control.
Thank you, Sue. And thank you so much for a very comprehensive and detailed contributions by all three, very influential and important speakers on China's globalization of media. We've got some interesting questions here, but before I jump on to reading the other questions, I will take the opportunity to actually have a question for all three speakers. I myself have been looking at China's role in Pakistani media as part of a BRI CPEC strategy, as part of as a coordinator for Media Freedom Initiative at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. But my question would be that, you know, we've had a very rich debate and discussion, and there have been some looming challenges that have been, I think, presented by all three speakers, which the looming challenges by China's global media would be technological penetration. Is it compromised reporting? Or, of course, it is economic incentivization provided by China in this aspect of media intervention. My question is, what is the most acute challenge facing freedom of expression by the Chinese in the upcoming months, considering that these three are the kind of technological penetration, IIA, the taking over of the artificial intelligence industry, economic incentivization, or compromised reporting or censorship? Which is the most acute problem in all your for all of you to think? And then I'm going to take the opportunity to have these three questions, very interesting questions that we've had. So one question is put in by Dr. Amir Hamza to Professor Daya Thusu, and his question is, As you mentioned that China's CGTN operate in different regions of the world in different countries, but what are your views about how such media messages are consumed by the citizens of the Commonwealth countries? Has it given China an opportunity to win their support or not? Then there is a question for Stephen Vines. And Stephen, I mean, I loved all your presentations. This question is from Hong Wang, and he says to Mr. Vines, if media is leaving Hong Kong, what is your view regarding Bloomberg stationed 55 more staff to Hong Kong just this year alone? Is Hong Kong being seen as merely a financial media hub now? And this is also what the CCP wants as well. And then we have one question for Dr. Wilson, and this is from Anilesh Kumar. And his question is, how do you see the role of Chinese media in challenging the Orientalist approach of the Western media towards reporting Africa? So I would leave all this, we clear all these questions first, and if we have time, then we have another set of round of questions. And thank you so much. The floor is for all of you. Shall we start with Professor Thusu for the question that he's been asked? Hello?
Yes, thank you. But I might just refer to your earlier intervention about what is the biggest threat, as it were. And I do think what's happening in the AI space is very deeply worrying. Somebody like me who is a Luddite, you know, but I do think because it is a, you know, it's, for example, think of European Union and its protection of privacy, and there's a whole system around that, which doesn't exist to that extent in China. And if it is globalizing, that means the world's data is coming into a system which is not open, transparent. So that, to me, that's the biggest worry. And you know, that's become a big discussion point for many, many countries, including in developing countries, and Commonwealth ones on that, especially on that. In response to the question that was specifically asked to me, that's a very difficult question to answer because there are very few studies done which measure the effectiveness of Chinese media, especially CGTN's presence. There are some academic publications. Some of my colleagues, friends have done work, but there isn't a comprehensive global study which looks at its impact in various parts of the world. This is ironical because China has spent billions of dollars, as Professor N. Wilson pointed out. The figures are difficult to you know, be absolutely sure about, but we're talking about like $9–10 billion in the last 10 years. That's a lot of money. And there isn't, and one of the things I wanted to do in Hong Kong is, you know, is to actually do a project which looks at it. And I'm not Western, I'm not Chinese, so I probably have an advantage of not being party to any of these two binaries. And but what Stephen said is very interesting because there is the kind of concern that, you know, that this might lead to some political trouble. So even if this guy who wants to do the work is not Chinese or not Western, but there might be an issue. So I haven't yet done it, but there's something I want to really do because I think this is crying out for decent research because it's so widely present and it's growing. And I think particularly with the digital space, in the digital space where this is going to be very important. That would be my, not a direct answer to the question, but I think the simple answer, Dr. Hamza, is that there is very little work to prove whether it's successful or not.
Stephen, can we have your input now? Thank you for my question, my part of the question and the other question that was asked. Thank you.
Well, they're both very interesting questions. I want to pick up on something that Sally Ann Wilson said about the parliamentary group being sponsored by TikTok. You know, I find that really interesting that the people there didn't know that TikTok was a Chinese company under all the controls that Chinese companies are under. And I think one of the most insidious things about the spreading influence of China is this indirect influence, which people are unaware of. You know, if you look at China Daily, great for putting you to sleep. If you look at CGTN, well, you know, you have to have a lot of patience to struggle your way through those turgid programs. But what you don't have, and what you don't know about, is the indirect influence caused by the great amounts of money that China has at its disposal, and where that influence is spreading without being labeled as propaganda, without being identified as such. The question about Bloomberg interests me, and it happens to be something that I've looked at. Yeah, it's quite true that the number of Bloomberg staff in Hong Kong has increased. Remember, of course, that Bloomberg is not essentially a news organization. It runs data terminals, and its business and its profits certainly don't come from the news side. They come from the data terminal provision. Bloomberg and I'm sure there's somebody more erudite than me who can correct me on the date, but Bloomberg in, I think it was 2018, ran some extremely, this is on the editorial side obviously, ran some extremely interesting reports about the financial interests of members of the Communist Party leadership and the literally mouth-watering sums of money that were being ferreted out of China by influential people at the top of the leadership. These reports had great circulation, they were read with avid interest, and after that, Bloomberg, and you draw your own conclusions how this happened, Bloomberg withdrew from that kind of investigative journalism within China. So the question was, will Hong Kong purely become an international center? Will it just focus on the financial aspects of reporting as far as the media is concerned? Well, I think there'll be some of that. But of course, you know, these people who run the Chinese Communist Party are supposed to be Marxists. Don't they understand that economics, finance, and politics are all connected? I'm not a Marxist myself, but I understand that connection, as Karl Marx did. So yes, of course, they have in mind that Hong Kong will behave itself and just confine itself to facilitating business with the People's Republic. They're not particularly interested in Hong Kong any longer being an international center. They rather hope that will happen.
Thank you, Stephen. Sally, concluding remarks, and we've got a whole range of new questions, but we're short of time, and so I'm just a bit rushing through, but we would like to have your kind of input, I mean, interesting observation. And I do want to have another question put in by David Page to you, Sally, which is, how do you think the Commonwealth should be responding to the Chinese challenge? And has the Media Freedom Coalition begun to make any inroads for public service media in Commonwealth countries? So I'd leave it before we go back to Dr. Onslow for our concluding remarks. Thank you. Sally, we can't hear you.
I think,
yes.
I think, let me deal with some of these and try and roll it into one thing. I think you raised three different particular areas of concern. I think for me, I use the example of a reception in Westminster to illustrate the fact of how insidious and pervasive the influence is across so many spheres, and how that has grown and grown and grown. So I think for me, it's not just saying, well, we'll push back in one sphere. I would like to see more pushbacks across the board, and that includes from within the Commonwealth. And it is one of the reasons why we sadly withdrew from the Commonwealth, because we just couldn't make enough inroads within the Commonwealth, though we still work closely with many colleagues there, about this is a serious issue. And, you know, when you see violations of media freedom not being dealt with at senior level within the Commonwealth by CMAG or whatever, then that is turning a back on what is happening. And I feel very strongly about that, because it does ultimately affect democracy and it affects human rights. So I think we have to tackle it and speak out whenever we find these sort of issues and they concern us, and we have evidence and we can verify it. David Page has mentioned the Media Freedom Coalition, which was a new initiative set up by both the UK and Canadian governments in 2019. It has a consultative network of 22 civil society organisations, and I sit as one of those members. What we have the power to do there is to hold signatories to account. So the signatories are, I think, 49 states now, Commonwealth and beyond, and we do have the power within that to go back and hold them to account and actually prepare cases ourselves from civil society to be put in front of the states if we see infringements. And there have been many cases of that. I doubt that China will ever be a signatory to the MFC. So I don't think in this instance, but I do think when you look at expertise within the Commonwealth on media, who as a state is enabled to become regarded as an expert on media freedom is a real issue. When I suspect, certainly in some of the recent groups, it's who wants to put their hands up and not necessarily looking at where those countries, and Steve mentioned Singapore, I mean, where those countries actually sit in terms of media freedom regulation. So I think there are lots of ways we could be tackling all of this much better than any of us can within the Commonwealth and outside. And I think it is something that, you know, thankfully we have lots of books. We need more writing. We need this to be more of a popular concern to raise the profile of what is happening.
Thank you so much. And for this, an incredibly, I mean, we have some comments, but and some more questions, but unfortunately we are running out of time. And but I would like to thank you from the Institute of Commonwealth Studies for taking out time and giving us these brilliant contributions and very much needed debate and discussion on whatever is happening, how the global media sphere is changing, and China is a big player in this kind of acute transformation, which is perhaps, as we've seen today, is unmanageable on so many accounts, but equally incredibly necessary to look at and getting more difficult to ignore. So off to Sue Onslow, who's going to give some concluding remarks. Wow. Hello, Sue, are you here?
Kieran, thank you very much. My concluding remark is to thank our three eminent speakers and to express my own admiration and appreciation for your insightful, knowledgeable and cogent remarks, which has underlined the concerted and pervasive way in which China has progressively exploited, explored and penetrated media landscapes. And to extend the analogies of use of power, it made me think of stealth power, except that this is an increasingly muscular player who is exploiting potential vulnerabilities, but also different agendas and approaches of countries across the globe. I'm minded to think that, is this a recast new international information order from the 1970s, but China is giving it a very particular geopolitical spin, which is, of course, entirely to support China's perception of its national and global interests. So thank you very much indeed to all of our speakers. Thank you to Kieran, particularly for organizing this, and to our audience for posing some very important questions. This is an issue that I think needs the publication, the discussion, the coverage, and the Institute is definitely going to be giving it its additional attention, supporting all of your work to highlight the importance of the potential malign and impact of this penetration of the media landscape for democratic values and for, as you identify, the importance of human rights, in which freedom of expression and the role of journalists and media independence is so vitally important. So thank you very much indeed to all concerned.